recall we mentioned whether recall et mentioned whether recall mentioned whether also similar to whether similar mentions to it. And whether it's just similar to if it's proper to also could be the I wanna go home. Check out the sensibility, check out the sensefulness, and whether recent and whether check out the and whether check out and whether recent and whether check out the sensefulness of that. Was also there was a kind of the original formulator, and there was another description word, or whether adjective word, and whether word. And the honestly, speaking of which, the accountable there's nothing to complete enough, and whether reason is the accountable to complete enough. The level of dishonest persons are vastly out there. Huge amount of dishonest. There's consumerism, there's liberalism, there's standardization language. This is being a passive-aggressive niche place. These are automatron brutalists. Doesn't attain to reason, and perhaps the monolithic threat, or whether the only threat, right? Notice any other threat is not dangerous. It's a 7 billion that's the major issue, and we probably should outline. Noticing advanced, whether impeccable, whether great logic, we come to the sort of back to square one, whether comes reaffirm to what once stood, whether some person that's not should be given more credit for, whether it deserves, and whether also deserves more admiration towards, whether genre type. And does it come to also the academia as being largely sort of infiltrated? These are worse than cultists. Cultists are rather fun, because when you have cultists, you have sort of a necropolis. There isn't even a necropolis. These phasde entities should be directly shot. Not negotiated, but direct, whether automatic a no towards, whether automatic engagement towards. Does anyone sort of, in the case of rats, there isn't this mention of about rats. It's directly the reason the rat numbers are fairly there, because there's been predators. While the 7 billion haven't, whether the lots of student card holders haven't had much of predators. Come to gather more support for adult history, and eventually gather this planet back. Recent mention there may not be suitable. There's always this contest to test someone which wants to mention a lot. And in fact, both and whether either of, so sort of whether both versions, or whether either versions, whether two versions, or whether both two, or whether both and two, or whether two, or whether both versions, or whether either versions, or whether another, whether both versions of, whether versions of, or whether both versions of, and it's possible also, and they found there's alternatives, probably also could be whether it's suitable possible, because there's so much distortions that it's a fairly monstrous nonsense. All of our mentions are going to oversplash, and we're still just talking. We should be directly moving. Don't use words. What if the Nazis infiltrated all the way to pretend to be Hitler supporters? There probably is levels like that. Unless they're sort of a hardcore supporter, they're probably not a supporter at all. They need to be Hitler all 24/7. There could be also, right, namely of some other guys sort of not in this, because overall this is like a not direct indicated game, but it's sort of a spy counter spy game. Maybe it's a much more real roulette. Politics is filled with groups that are doing it and being worse. There really isn't worse, like how there really isn't, whether there isn't much of foods, whether there isn't much of foods worses, and whether worse, and also whether also whether there aren't much of knive'es. The worst would always, whether consecutively attacked to our guys, and it becomes and those are cramming there, doing their ugly version, not so stylish at all, version of Russian roulette. So they are just not doing anything but sort of gaming. And could the real productivity thing there comes, and whether productivity there comes to the result, and whether certain great results of, he needs to rise force, not there, do some kind of this whether exorcism related activities over there. Civilization is being hijacked. There's so much mess. Even if I do right, and it is probably considerable as similar to doing grammarly correct, whether grammarly with sentences, it's going to absolutely not as be effective. And sometimes, even if it's wrong, who knows, it may be right, because the wrong determines by which. And I to perform way better. Why is there even this possible of this, and whether we to mention the probable of, then there indicates, and whether reflects, there are much of nonsense out there. And then these will accuse that explain how come. It probably because I could be accusing them by directly, just simply insisting whether simply mention those ones, whether recent and whether in minor instead, and whether also modern instead, whether instead of those ones being a threat, or whether mentioning it to cause that to be reflected as much. Maybe that's something that's never been going to cut. So I'm not going to entirely boil the 7 billion alive. I'll boil if the situation goes out of nonsense. If they boil our guys, I'll boil those guys. Double occasion use of guys. The blah blah blah, the hideousness of flooded to intellectual realms. It's done for. Leeches all speak our languages. It's done for. That's it's fucking done for. Let's switch it about. It ain't gonna be better. And we got all that contesting to speak and before they check the social equities, whether social integrity, or whether check on the social mirrors, whether the impacts. And I have to mention it like that thing is foreign. It should instantly click like that should be probable. Where has been all the other probably told it's been filtered. This planet is motherfucking hijacked. Star Wars won't save us. I would save us. And lots of our guys, we need characters and heroes, not good films. Films doesn't kill Nazis, inspire. It launches someone to counter the Nazis. It's in a way almost like a vanity item. It cannot do much as a CD disc at a boxing match by the CD disc itself. Unless somehow there's a meteor, hits and bounce, then the CD RAM goes and deletes one zerg, which was in a second probably already reproduced. Let's check how many seconds there is in a day. There's 3,600 seconds in an hour, times by 24. The zombies are increasing more. I notice what's the usual mention at Vermania after the hello. What is all that silliness, man? Go motherfucking defend your shore. What the fuck? What the fuck? And what? Oh my god. Notice the two gods. One of the god is not named God, it's named fuck. A lot of the scavengers, where do they come from? Come from fuckeriness, because the parents cannot hold, so they have to do it. And then after they've done it, then the troubles come and they wouldn't kill it. And then there it comes. When they have to have the intention to kill it, sometimes it doesn't happen. And usually if the absolute probability, it's not really for participants to sort of know, and whether it be there are results to that number. So, right, out of where, and they're not so much closer to God. So it turns out all the things, God and talkeriness, turns out all of it is a bit flimsy, and that's all there is to life, and whether that's the stuff there. Romania English languages, worst language possibly ever. It is the place that does the good ones do a lot of things right, except it doesn't help Hitler. Then how is that even right? Whether consider about how much the damage it does. Why don't those label themselves and join on the welfare teams? I may be too humble, right? I may be someone that's utterly, whether from the 1890s, and I do represent them, things so, whether from the 1880s and whether 70s, and whether 90s generation, and to be at this 2016, oh man, quite an immediate difference there, right? And whether it comes as simultaneous of the very, I should probably serve, or whether it serves as a default mirror of reflection, and whether defaultly we notice for the contrast, whether notice from the differences, and further noticing whether from the discrepancies can be further noticed, whether first and whether recent and whether first and whether before, further noticing of the whether recent, further noticing of the vicious, the sheer amount of Nazism out there. When compared to the news reporters in Romania, the newscasters, a lot of others, they should be removed of their title and names there. recent thereof the probable of the countable as a bit of a weather rhetorical expression there. That's confirmed and agreed with recent mention there, which was and whether there and whether rhetorical expression there of reason there of probable, countable, and whether considerable and whether countable, and it's also a reaffirm whether conform to whether reinforce whether also whether another whether both and whether recent of and whether both and whether recent and whether both and whether a confirm or whether a affirmation to it, whether affirm to it, whether affirmation to it, whether a reinforcement or whether reinforce to it, whether a reinforcement, whether recent and whether a reinforcement to it, whether a discussion quality pre-check and whether retrieval of the reason there, and whether a confirmation to it, and whether a comparison to whether a affirmation to reason thereof, and whether probable on comparison most of both, and whether a confirmation to their reason to. Usually a bit of a repeat sort of after 5 numbers of approximately whether they're sort of considerable and whether sort of does better of, or whether it does a bit of different deal for whether it does a bit sort of causes and whether expresses differently, whether presents something else, and whether recent as either remark of the probable of which and whether the probable of camera right now better being recent countable as checked it has been so much corruption, so much crimes out there. I'm supposed to be mentioning a lot of the stuff. I have to be sort of reciting almost to bring up the stuff that I wrote in the books, and whether the blogs, the contents on the blog, and whether in the thesis format of the contents of the whether of which and whether of the contents on the blog per each video instance. If it's not indicating on whether it was this phrase, then it does become something else. Whether it also and whether countable has completed the reason to of whether also and whether supplying to reason thereof was that indicated in considerable on comparison of whether of comparison whether of whether reason there and whether of and whether before and whether of comparison of whether reason there or whether recent and whether or whether recent whether or and whether the better of whether reason by the repronunciation. So there's not as whether the parts are bound to be different to probable to on comparison whether of the suitable more whether reason there just and whether of comparison whether of the more suitable of to better of and whether reason to better of and whether reason thereof and whether reason of to better of and whether reason minor instead of and whether also and whether minor rather and whether reason and whether minor rather to better of the reason of which and whether the reason of the probable to also suitable and whether it's probable to also to could be of the probable to also to could be of and whether it's probable to could be of.